Hey everyone, I'm Peter Stories here to guide you today. If you use this video to drift off to sleep, please tap like, hit subscribe, and drop a comment telling me where you're watching from and what time it is there. Now settle in, get cozy, and let yourself relax. The moss grew thick enough to muffle footsteps, Daniel Reeves had learned, which meant you could walk within 10 feet of someone in the Olympic rainforest and never know they were there. He'd been a ranger for 6 years at Olympic National Park, and that particular fact still bothered him more than he cared to admit. Especially on days like this when he was hiking alone up the Enchanted Valley Trail to check on an overdue backcountry permit. The permit holder was Lauren Keating, 28, from Seattle, solo hiker. She'd filed for 5 days in the Kinole River drainage and was now 3 days past her return date. Her emergency contact, a sister in Bellevue, had called the ranger station that morning, voice tight with the particular tension of someone trying not to imagine the worst while knowing they probably should. Daniel had volunteered to make the wellness check. He'd told himself it was because he knew the Enchanted Valley better than most, having worked this section for 3 seasons. That was true enough. What he didn't say was that solo investigations had become easier than partnered ones. Easier to be alone with the particular silence that lived inside his head since the macaw incident 2 years ago. The trail climbed steadily through old-growth forest, where Douglas firs and Sitka spruce blocked out most of the October sky. The trees here were older than the country itself, their bark textured like elephant skin, their roots writhing over the trail in gnarled patterns that could turn an ankle if you weren't careful. Everything dripped. The Olympic Peninsula got over 12 feet of rain annually, and the forest held moisture the way a sponge holds water. Dense, saturated, perpetually damp. Moss hung from branches in pale green curtains. Ferns as tall as a man crowded the understory. Daniel's boots squelched in mud. His Motorola radio crackled with static every few minutes, the signal already degrading this far from the ranger station. He'd tried his Nokia cell phone at the trailhead. No service, as expected. The GPS unit clipped to his pack was a Garmin E-Trex from 2006, reliable enough but with position accuracy that could drift 20 feet in heavy tree cover. He carried paper maps, a compass, and the kind of self-reliance that came from knowing technology failed exactly when you needed it most. At mile 7, he found the first marker, a blue bandana tied to a branch at the junction with the Graves Creek Trail. Daniel stopped, studying it. The fabric was soaked through but not faded, which meant it hadn't been there long. Standard trail marker for solo hikers, a breadcrumb system in case they needed to backtrack. Lauren was following protocol. That was something. He keyed his radio. Ranger Reeves to base, found marker at Graves Creek Junction, continuing north. Static, then dispatch. Copy that, Daniel. Be advised, weather system moving in tonight. Front expected around 2100 hours. Understood. He checked his watch. 1445 hours. Plenty of daylight left, but the afternoon was already dimming under the canopy. The second marker appeared a mile later. Another bandana, this one green, then orange, then red, each tied carefully at junctions or potentially confusing sections. Lauren knew what she was doing. Daniel felt a small knot of tension ease. Experienced hikers who followed protocol rarely ended badly. Usually it was equipment failure, a twisted ankle, maybe sitting out weather in their tent and losing track of days. He'd done dozens of these wellness checks. Most ended with a sheepish hiker and a handshake. Most, not all. The trail opened abruptly at mile 11 into Enchanted Valley proper, and Daniel stopped to take in the view despite having seen it hundreds of times. The valley floor spread wide and flat, a meadow of waist-high grass bisected by the braided channels of the Kinole River. The valley walls rose sheer on both sides, granite faces streaked with waterfalls that caught the filtered light in threads of silver. At the valley's head, the dark mass of Anderson Glacier hung between peaks, feeding the river with meltwater that made the whole valley echo with the sound of rushing water. The Enchanted Valley Chalet sat in the middle of the meadow, a 2-story log structure built in 1931 and now maintained by the Park Service as an emergency shelter. Daniel scanned the area with his binoculars. No smoke from the chalet's chimney. No tents visible in the camping area north of the building. He keyed his radio again. Reeves to base, at Enchanted Valley. No visual on subject yet. Checking designated camping zones. Copy. Keep us posted. The camping area was a quarter-mile past the chalet, a series of designated sites marked by wooden posts in the trees. Daniel found Lauren's camp at Site 7. The tent was still standing. That was the first thing that struck him as wrong. A small two-person REI backpacking tent, forest green, properly staked and fly-secured. The vestibule was zipped shut. No damage from weather or animals. The rain cover showed water beading properly, which meant the fabric coating was intact. Everything looked maintained. Daniel approached slowly, that particular sixth sense that came from years of backcountry work starting to ping warnings he couldn't yet articulate. Ms. Keating? Lauren? This is Ranger Reeves with Olympic National Park. No response. The forest swallowed his voice like it swallowed everything else. He circled the tent. A bear canister sat properly stored 15 feet away, rope hung from a branch per regulations. Her boots were tucked neatly under the vestibule awning. A pair of Merrill hiking boots, women's size 8, dry under the protective overhang. The boots were what made Daniel's stomach drop. You didn't leave your boots behind in the backcountry, not unless you weren't planning to come back or couldn't. Lauren? He raised his voice, scanning the tree line. If you can hear me, I need you to respond. Your sister is worried. I'm here to help. The river provided the only answer, that constant white noise of moving water. Daniel pulled on a latex glove from his first aid kit, protocol for potentially disturbed scenes, and unzipped the tent vestibule. The smell that emerged wasn't decay, which was a relief, just the musty odor of confined space and damp nylon. Inside, everything was organized with almost unsettling precision. Sleeping bag rolled and stuffed, sleeping pad deflated and folded. Stove and fuel canister secured in a stuff sack. Her pack leaned against the back wall, fully loaded, hip belt clipped. A small solar charger was attached to the pack's exterior, its LED indicator showing green, fully charged. On top of the sleeping bag sat a moleskin journal, closed, with a Bic pen resting on the cover. Daniel stared at the journal for longer than necessary. Something about its placement felt deliberate, like it was waiting to be found. He picked it up carefully, opened to the last written page. Lauren's handwriting was clear, slightly slanted, the letters pressed deep into the paper. October 14th, 2008, Day 4. Can't sleep. Keep standing at the tree line. Same spot as last night. White dress, long black hair covering face. Just standing, watching the tent. I know what you're thinking reading this. I know how it sounds. But I'm not hallucinating. I'm not hypothermic. Temperature's been mild, low 50s at night. I've been drinking water, eating properly. My head is clear. She's real, and she wants me to see her. The Japanese loggers, the ones who died in 1923. I found their camp today, off-trail near the Anderson Creek Fork. Stone foundation still there, mostly covered in moss. And markers. Wooden markers with names carved in kanji I can't read. One marker was different. Newer, maybe. The wood less weathered. And there was red fabric tied to it. Silk, I think. The kind you see in pictures of Japanese shrines. When I came back to camp, she was closer. Not at the tree line anymore. Halfway across the meadow. Same white dress. Same hair. Not moving. Just present. I should leave. Every rational part of my brain is screaming to pack up and hike out. But I can't shake the feeling that she's showing me something. That there's a reason she's here. A reason I'm here. The temperature dropped 20 degrees when she appeared. My breath fogged. In October. In 50-degree weather. I'm going to try to approach her tonight. I need to know what she wants. The entry ended there. Daniel flipped forward. Blank pages. He flipped backward through earlier entries. Standard hiking journal stuff, trail conditions, wildlife sightings, philosophical musings about solitude. All perfectly normal until the entry from October 13th. Saw someone at dusk, woman in white, Long, dark hair, standing near the river. Called out, but she didn't respond. Gone when I looked again, probably another hiker, though I haven't seen anyone else in 2 days. Daniel's hands were steady as he closed the journal, but that old familiar tightness had returned to his chest. The one that came with too many coincidences, too many details that didn't fit the rational explanations he was supposed to provide. He'd read enough missing persons reports to know the patterns. Hypothermia caused delirium. People wandered off in confused states. They took off clothes because their overheated brains misread signals. They made poor decisions based on scrambled perceptions. But hypothermia didn't explain organized campsites. It didn't explain carefully written journal entries about specific locations and historical details. And it sure as hell didn't explain someone walking out of camp without their boots. Daniel photographed the tent's interior with his digital camera, a Canon PowerShot that the Park Service had issued earlier that year. He bagged the journal as evidence. Then he backed out of the tent and stood in the campsite, turning slowly, trying to see what Lauren had seen. The Enchanted Valley lived up to its name in a way that made Daniel's skin prickle. The afternoon light was fading faster now, the sun blocked by the western valley wall. Shadows stretched across the meadow like reaching fingers. The waterfalls on the granite faces seemed louder than they should be, their white noise almost forming patterns if you listened too carefully. And the trees, those ancient moss-draped giants, felt less like silent witnesses and more like an audience. Daniel had felt this way before. 2 years ago on a search and rescue in the Ozette Triangle area near the Macaw Reservation. 7-year-old boy, missing for 2 days. They'd found him eventually, alive, hypothermic but responsive. But what the boy had described seeing in those woods, what several of the Macaw searchers claimed to have glimpsed in the fog, had never quite settled right in Daniel's mind. He'd written it off as mass suggestion. Stress. The brain's tendency to find patterns in chaos. He'd written it off, and then he'd started having the dreams. The radio crackled. Base to Reeves. Status? Daniel keyed the mic. Found subject's camp at Site 7. Tent intact, gear present. No sign of subject. Evidence suggests she may have left camp voluntarily during evening hours. Day 4 of her trip. Recovered journal with... He paused, choosing words carefully. With concerning entries. Requesting SAR team for grid search, starting at first light. Copy that. You planning to stay on site tonight? Daniel looked at the tent, then at the darkening tree line. Every instinct said to hike out now, while he still had daylight. But protocol was protocol. You didn't abandon a scene in an active missing persons case. And besides, Lauren might return to her camp. It happened sometimes. Affirmative. I'll bivouac near the chalet. Radio check at 600. Stay safe, Daniel. Weather's coming in heavy. He signed off and started setting up his own tent near the chalet, where regulations allowed emergency camping for rangers. The chalet itself was locked for the season, but it provided some windbreak. As Daniel worked, hammering stakes and tensioning guy lines, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He'd felt this way on the Macaw search too, right before they found the boy, right before they found the other things. By the time Daniel finished setting up camp, full darkness had settled over the valley. The temperature had dropped noticeably. He could see his breath now, which seemed wrong for mid-October at this elevation. The forecast had called for lows in the mid-40s. This felt closer to freezing. He started a small fire in the designated ring near the chalet, as much for psychological comfort as warmth. The flames pushed back the darkness maybe 10 feet, turning everything beyond into an impenetrable wall of black. The sound of the river filled the space where human noise should be. Conversation, laughter, the comfortable sounds of other campers. But Daniel was alone. Completely alone in a valley that suddenly felt far too large and far too empty. He heated water for freeze-dried chili, eating mechanically while his mind worked through possibilities. Lauren's journal mentioned Japanese loggers dying in 1923. Daniel had a vague awareness of the Olympic Peninsula's logging history. Japanese immigrants had been a significant part of the workforce in the early 20th century, facing discrimination and dangerous conditions. But he didn't know about any specific incident in 1923, and he'd never heard about a logging camp near Anderson Creek. That was something to verify. If Lauren had found physical evidence of a camp, that was a concrete lead. But the rest of it, the woman in white, the temperature drop, the feeling of being watched, that fell into a category Daniel had trained himself not to think about too carefully. He pulled out his own notebook and sketched a map of the valley, marking Lauren's last known position and the location she'd mentioned near Anderson Creek. Tomorrow, if the SAR team hadn't found her by first light, he'd check that area himself. Physical evidence was good. Physical evidence was something you could work with. The fire popped, sending sparks spiraling into the darkness. Daniel added another log and settled back against his pack, trying to ignore the way the shadows seemed to move at the edge of his vision. Just tricks of firelight. Pattern recognition gone haywire. That's when he heard it. A sound like silk dragging across grass, coming from the direction of Lauren's camp. Daniel's hand went to the mag light on his belt. He clicked it on, the beam cutting through darkness that felt suddenly solid, resistant to penetration. The sound stopped. "Lauren?" His voice came out harder than intended. "If that's you, I need you to identify yourself." Nothing. Just the river and the wind and the peculiar silence that settled between sounds in these mountains. Daniel stood, playing the flashlight beam across the meadow toward the camping area. The grass moved in the wind, creating patterns of light and shadow. His light caught the green of Lauren's tent, maybe 80 yards away. The tent flap moved slightly. Just wind. Had to be wind. But something about the movement seemed wrong. Too purposeful. He started walking toward it, each step deliberate, his free hand resting on the canister of bear spray on his hip. Protocol said he should radio this in, but what would he say? That he heard something that might have been fabric? That he had a bad feeling? Halfway across the meadow, the temperature dropped again. Precipitously. Daniel's breath came out in thick clouds. The moisture in the air seemed to crystallize, creating a faint haze that his flashlight couldn't quite penetrate. And beneath the sound of the river, almost subliminal, he heard something that might have been breathing, or might have been wind moving through a particular gap in the trees, or might have been his own pulse hammering in his ears. The tent was empty when he reached it. Of course it was empty. He'd searched it hours ago and nothing had changed. The journal was gone, bagged as evidence in his pack, but everything else remained exactly as he'd found it. Sleeping bag, stove, that carefully organized gear that suggested Lauren had left intentionally, knowing she could return. Except she hadn't returned. Daniel played his light across the ground near the tent. No fresh tracks. The mud held prints from his own boots and what he assumed were Lauren's. Smaller tread pattern, different lug design, but nothing new. Nothing to explain the sound he'd heard. He was about to turn back when the flashlight beam caught something at the tree line. A flash of white, there and gone, like fabric disappearing behind a trunk. "Lauren." Daniel moved toward the spot, his light stabbing ahead. "I'm a ranger with Olympic National Park. You're not in trouble. Your sister is worried. I just need to know you're okay." The trees swallowed his voice. He reached the spot where he'd seen the white flash. Nothing. Just moss-covered trunks and ferns and the impenetrable darkness of the old-growth forest pressing in from all sides. But the cold remained. Unnatural, penetrating cold that made his joints ache and his breath come in ragged gasps. And there, on the bark of a Sitka spruce, something that made him stop completely. Scratches. 4 parallel lines carved deep into the bark at roughly eye level. Fresh enough that sap still glistened in the grooves, but wrong. The spacing was too wide for a bear, too deep for anything except claws designed specifically to tear through wood, or fingernails grown long and sharp with decades of rage. Daniel stepped back, his light playing across nearby trees. More marks. Dozens of them, all at the same height, all with that same 4-line pattern, all leading deeper into the forest like a trail of breadcrumbs designed to lure someone away from safety. His radio crackled, making him jump. "Reeves, you there? Getting some weird interference. You okay?" Daniel keyed the mic, his thumb shaking slightly. Yeah, He paused. Was he okay? I'm at the subject's tent. Thought I heard something, but it was probably just wind. Copy. Get some sleep. Long day tomorrow. Yeah. Daniel clicked off the radio and stood in the darkness, listening to the forest breathe around him. Sleep, he thought. Right. He made it back to his tent near the chalet, built up the fire again, and crawled into his sleeping bag fully clothed, bear spray and flashlight within arm's reach. His mind kept returning to the journal entry. White dress, long black hair covering face, just standing, watching, and the cold. That impossible cold. Daniel had experienced hypothermia during his wilderness first responder training. He knew the signs: confusion, drowsiness, loss of coordination, eventually unconsciousness and death. But he also knew that hypothermic hallucinations were typically confused, nonsensical, not detailed observations about specific historical events and geographic locations. Lauren's writing had been clear, methodical. The handwriting never wavered. Whatever she'd experienced in this valley, she'd been lucid enough to document it carefully, which meant either it was real or she'd suffered some kind of psychological break that presented with unusual clarity. Daniel didn't want to think about which option scared him more. He must have dozed eventually because he jolted awake to complete darkness, the fire reduced to coals, and the sound of someone screaming. No, not screaming, singing, high and thin and distant, coming from somewhere up valley. A woman's voice carrying across the meadow in a melody that seemed to writhe through the air like something alive. The language wasn't English. Daniel couldn't place it, but something about the cadence felt Asian. Japanese, maybe? The same heritage Lauren had mentioned in her journal. He grabbed his flashlight and unzipped his tent, the cold hitting him like a physical force. His thermometer clipped to the outside of his pack read 28 degrees. 28 degrees Fahrenheit in mid-October at 2,000 feet elevation. Impossible. The singing continued, weaving through the sound of the river, and now Daniel could see something up valley near the base of Anderson Glacier. A light, pale and flickering like candlelight, except no candle could be visible from this distance. Daniel's hands found his radio. Protocol demanded he call this in. But what would he say? I hear singing and see lights, and the temperature has dropped 40 degrees, and I think maybe Lauren Keating found something in these woods that's been waiting here for 85 years, and now it's awake and it's hungry and it wants... Wants what? He thought about the scratches on the trees, the careful trail leading deeper into forest. The way Lauren's journal described someone showing her something, drawing her toward a revelation she couldn't resist. Daniel thought about the Maka search, the boy they'd found alive, and the other thing they'd found, the one none of them talked about afterward, the one that appeared in Daniel's dreams with increasing frequency, wearing different faces, but always delivering the same message. You left us here, in the dark, and we're still waiting. The singing stopped abruptly. In the silence that followed, Daniel heard footsteps. Not the soft pad of boots on grass, but something heavier, dragging, coming from the direction of Lauren's tent. He swung his flashlight toward the sound and caught a glimpse, just a fraction of a second, of something white moving between trees. Not fabric, not quite. Something that gleamed wet in the flashlight beam, translucent as fish scales, with that suggestion of movement that wasn't quite human. Hair that hung past visible limits, black as pitch, concealing whatever lay beneath. Then it was gone, and Daniel was alone in the meadow with his hammering heart and the smell of ozone and something else. Something organic and rotten, like flowers left too long in standing water. The smell from the Maka search, the one he'd convinced himself he'd imagined. Daniel backed toward his tent, flashlight sweeping the tree line, every nerve screaming at him to run. But where? The nearest ranger station was 11 miles back the way he'd come, through darkness and forest and whatever else was out here. And Lauren was still missing. That was his job. Find Lauren. Bring her home, even if home was the last place she wanted to go. He spent the rest of the night sitting against the chalet wall, fire built up high, flashlight in one hand and bear spray in the other. watching the tree line and trying not to think about how many different kinds of monsters wore human shapes. The singing didn't return, but the cold persisted, and twice more he thought he saw movement at the edge of his vision, white flashes that vanished when he turned his head. Dawn came reluctantly, the sky above the valley lightening to gray without ever quite achieving color. Daniel radioed base as soon as he had signal, his voice hoarse from cold and lack of sleep. "SAR team's on the way," dispatch told him. "ETA 3 hours. You want to wait or start the search?" Daniel looked at the forest, then at his map with its notation of Anderson Creek. "I'm going to check a location the subject mentioned in her journal. Off trail near the Anderson Creek Fork. If I'm not back by the time SAR arrives, send them after me. I'll leave flagging tape." "Copy that. Be careful, Daniel." Careful. Right. He packed light, radio, GPS, first aid kit, emergency bivouac gear, water, energy bars, left his tent standing so SAR would have a reference point. Then he headed up valley following the Quinault River toward the glacier. The forest here was even older than the lower sections, the trees massive beyond comprehension. Some of the trunks were 15 feet in diameter, their crowns lost in a canopy so thick it created permanent twilight. Nurse logs as big as houses lay decomposing across the forest floor, giving birth to new generations of trees that grew from their rotting mass. Everything was layered, moss on bark, on rock, on soil, on more moss. Life consuming death, consuming life in endless cycle. Daniel found the Anderson Creek Fork after 40 minutes of bushwhacking. The creek itself was running high with glacier melt, clear and cold, cutting through granite bedrock. He turned north following the stream, looking for anything that might indicate historical habitation. He almost missed it. The stone foundation was exactly where Lauren had described, maybe 200 yards up from the fork, tucked into a bench where the terrain flattened enough for construction. Moss covered everything, thick as carpet, but beneath the green, Daniel could make out the rectangular outline of a structure, maybe 20 by 30 feet, substantial for a logging camp. And the markers. 6 of them, wooden posts driven into the ground in 2 rows of 3, positioned where grave markers might be. The wood was weathered gray, split and rotted in places, but the kanji carved into each post was still visible. Daniel didn't read Japanese, but he photographed each marker carefully, knowing someone at the university could translate. One marker was different, just as Lauren had noted. The wood was newer, maybe cedar with that particular reddish hue, and tied to the top was a length of red silk, faded but still recognizable. The fabric moved in a breeze Daniel couldn't feel. He knelt beside the marker, studying the kanji. 3 characters carved with care, the strokes deep and deliberate, and beneath the characters in English, roughly scratched as if added later, Hanako, beloved daughter, wronged. Daniel's breath caught. He pulled out his notebook and wrote down the name, then started photographing the site systematically. The foundation stones, the markers, the red silk. Everything Lauren would have seen when she found this place. That's when he noticed the footprints. Fresh boot prints in the mud near the creek. Women's size 8, Merrill tread pattern. Lauren's boots, except Lauren's boots were back at her tent, neatly stored under the vestibule. Daniel followed the tracks. They led away from the markers, moving deeper into the forest along the creek. The stride pattern was wrong, too close together, almost shuffling, like someone walking in a trance, or being led. The tracks ended at a cedar tree 50 yards from the old logging camp. Not ended, stopped. No signs of turning back, no indication of where Lauren might have gone from that point. Just those final prints in the mud, toes pointing toward the tree trunk. Daniel approached the cedar slowly. It was ancient even by rainforest standards, easily 1,000 years old, its trunk hollowed at the base by fire or rot. The hollow was large enough to accommodate a person, large enough to hide in, or be hidden in. He pointed his flashlight into the darkness of the hollow and immediately wished he hadn't. Lauren sat inside, or what remained of Lauren. Her body was positioned upright, back against the inner wall, legs folded. Her eyes were open but filmed over with the flat opacity of death. Her face held an expression somewhere between terror and ecstasy, mouth open in a silent scream or perhaps a laugh. It was impossible to tell which. She was barefoot, which explained the boots back at camp. Her feet showed no signs of the damage you'd expect from hiking bootless through a rainforest. No cuts, no abrasions, no mud. They were clean, almost pristine. But her hands. Lauren's hands were another story. The fingernails had been torn away, leaving raw beds that had bled out across her palms, and her fingers were positioned in front of her face, curved like claws, frozen in the act of scratching at something. Her face? The tree? Something invisible Daniel couldn't see? Daniel backed away from the hollow, his stomach heaving. He'd found bodies before, that was part of the job, but something about Lauren's expression, about the wrongness of her clean feet and destroyed hands, made his skin crawl in ways that had nothing to do with ordinary death. He keyed his radio with shaking hands. "Reeves to base, I found her. She's deceased. I'm marking the site. Send the SAR team and notify the county sheriff. We're going to need a medical examiner." The radio crackled back static and broken words. "Copy, body location. Anderson Creek, about 200 yards north of the fork with the main river. There's an old logging camp. The radio died completely. No static, no carrier tone, just silence. Daniel checked the battery indicator. Full charge. He tried his cell phone out of habit. No signal, but that was expected. The GPS unit still worked, at least, showing his coordinates. 47.7928 degree N, 123.5247 degree W. He wrote them down in his notebook, along with detailed notes about the scene and Lauren's condition. That's when he heard the singing again. Closer this time, coming from the direction of the old logging camp. The same high, thin melody, but now Daniel could make out individual words, or sounds that might be words. The vowels were drawn out, almost wailing. The consonants were sharp and clipped, and beneath the singing, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. Daniel turned slowly. She stood among the grave markers exactly as Lauren had described. White dress that might have been a burial shroud, falling past her feet to drag in the moss. Long black hair that completely obscured her face, hanging in a curtain so thick and dark it seemed to absorb light. Bare feet that didn't quite touch the ground, hovering perhaps an inch above the moss. And the cold. That impossible penetrating cold that made Daniel's joints lock and his breath freeze in his lungs. The figure didn't move toward him. Didn't need to. Daniel could feel the pull of her, the gravitational weight of her presence drawing him forward like a riptide. His feet took a step before his conscious mind caught up and forced him to stop. "Who are you?" His voice came out strangled. "What do you want?" The singing stopped. In the silence, Daniel could hear his own heartbeat, could hear the blood rushing in his ears, could hear things moving in the forest around him, small sounds, rustling sounds, the sound of many feet on moss. The figure's hand emerged from beneath the hair, pale skin, almost translucent, fingers that were too long, joints in wrong places, fingernails that curved like talons, stained dark with something that might have been earth or might have been old blood. The hand pointed, not at Daniel, past him, toward the cedar tree where Lauren's body sat in permanent vigil. Then the figure spoke. The voice was Lauren's voice. Exactly Lauren's voice, with all the right inflections and Seattle accent, and that particular timbre Daniel recognized from the ranger station's description and the social media photos the sister had provided. But it came from beneath that curtain of hair, from a throat that had been dead 85 years. "She saw me," Lauren's voice said from the figure's mouth. She understood. She didn't run. Daniel's training warred with instinct. Training said there had to be a rational explanation. Ventriloquism, recording device, his own mind breaking under stress. Instinct said, "Run, you idiot, run, now run, run, run." He compromised by taking 3 careful steps backward, hands raised in a placating gesture. "I don't understand." What did Lauren understand? The figure tilted its head, hair swaying but never parting enough to reveal what lay beneath. What they did. To my father, to my brothers, to me. The loggers? Daniel's voice cracked. The Japanese loggers who died in 1923? Murdered. The word came out flat, factual. For wanting fair pay, for asking to be treated like men. They killed 6 of us, burned the camp with our bodies inside, said it was an accident, said we were careless with the fire. Daniel's mind raced, trying to remember Olympic Peninsula history. There had been labor conflicts in the logging camps, he knew that much, discrimination against Asian workers. But a massacre? That seemed like something that would be recorded, documented, taught. Unless it was covered up. Unless the perpetrators had enough power to bury the truth along with the bodies. You're Hanako, Daniel said. Hanako, the wronged daughter. The figure took a step closer, still not touching the ground. The moss didn't compress beneath her feet. I was 15. I watched them kill my father. I watched them throw his body in the fire. I ran. Another step. The cold intensified. Daniel's breath came out in clouds so thick he could barely see through them. I ran through these woods for 3 days before they found me. They said I would tell. They said no one would believe a Japanese girl, but they couldn't take the chance. So they fixed the problem. Daniel didn't want to imagine what fixed meant in 1923 Olympic Peninsula logging country. Didn't want to, but couldn't stop the images from forming. A 15-year-old girl alone in the forest, hunted. They drowned me in the river, Hanako continued in Lauren's voice. Held me under until I stopped fighting. Left my body in the water for animals. No grave, no marker, no name in any record. But you have a marker, Daniel said, gesturing toward the cedar post with its red silk. Someone remembered you. For the first time, emotion entered that stolen voice. Something that might have been bitter laughter. My mother. She survived. She waited 50 years before she was old enough and alone enough that no one watched her anymore. Then she came back. She found where they left me and she marked the spot. She tied that silk and she said the prayers and she told me I could rest. But you didn't rest. How could I? The figure's hand clenched, nails digging into its own palm. They're all dead now. The men who killed us. Dead and buried in proper graves with proper markers. Their names on monuments in logging towns. Heroes of industry. I have nothing, my father has nothing, my brothers, nothing. Just unmarked graves in a forest that forgets. Daniel's throat was tight. What does this have to do with Lauren? She saw me. The figure took another step. They were maybe 10 feet apart now. She saw me and she didn't run. She wanted to know. She wanted to understand. So I showed her. Showed her what? The figure raised its other hand. Both arms spread wide, and for the first time the curtain of hair parted slightly. Daniel caught a glimpse of what lay beneath. Not a face, not exactly, but something that might once have been a face before water and time and rage had transformed it into something else. Pale flesh that was almost see-through, eye sockets that went too deep, a mouth that opened too wide. I showed her how it feels, Hanako said. To drown, to claw at the water, to breathe in liquid and feel your lungs burn and know you're dying and know no one will remember and know the world will go on like you never existed. Daniel understood then. Lauren's clean feet and destroyed hands, her expression of terror and ecstasy. She hadn't died of hypothermia or exposure or any natural cause. She'd experienced what Hanako had experienced. Hanako had shared the memory, the sensation, the complete horror of her own death. And it had killed Lauren just as surely as the river had killed Hanako 85 years ago. Why? Daniel whispered. Why kill her if she was trying to understand? The figure dropped its arms. The hair fell back into place, mercifully obscuring that almost face. I didn't mean to kill her, I meant to show her, to make her bear witness, but the memory was too strong. The rage was too strong. Once I started sharing it, I couldn't stop. And by the time I pulled back, she was... Hanako gestured vaguely toward the cedar tree. I put her there. In a tree. Like the burial her people practice, sky burial elevated. More respect than they gave me. I thought maybe that would be enough. Maybe I could rest then. But you can't. No. The word was heavy with exhaustion that transcended mortality. The rage won't let me. It's been growing for 85 years, feeding on memory, on injustice, on the fact that 6 people died and no one was punished and no one even remembered. And now it's stronger than I am. It controls me, uses me, won't let me rest no matter how much I want to. Daniel's radio crackled unexpectedly back to life. Reeves? Daniel, do you copy? SR team is at your camp. We need your position. Hanako's head snapped toward the sound. The temperature dropped another impossible increment. Daniel's exposed skin burned with cold. Frost formed on his jacket. More witnesses, Hanako said, and now her voice held something terrible. A hunger that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with the human need to be seen, to be remembered, to matter. More people to share the memory with. More people to understand what was taken from us. No. Daniel keyed his radio with numb fingers. Stay back. Don't come up Anderson Creek. The subject is deceased, but there's... What? What could he possibly say? There's a hazardous condition. I need everyone to stay at the valley floor until I can... The radio died again. This time when Daniel checked it, the battery indicator was completely drained despite being fully charged 15 minutes ago. His GPS was dead too. Flashlight dead. Camera dead. Every electronic device he carried had been leached of power. Not by cold, by something else. By proximity to something that consumed energy like a black hole consumed light. You don't have to do this, Daniel said, forcing himself to meet those hidden eyes. I can help. I can tell your story. Make sure people know what happened. Give you and your family the recognition you deserve. Hanako laughed, and this time it was her own voice, young, bitter, aged beyond any 15-year-old should sound. Do you think I haven't heard that before? Lauren said the same thing. She promised to tell everyone, to write articles, to make sure we were remembered. But promises don't change what happened. Promises don't make the rage go away. Then what will? Nothing. The word was final as a coffin lid closing. Nothing will ever be enough. That's what I've learned. No amount of witnesses, no amount of understanding. The only thing that helps is sharing it, making others feel what I felt. And even that only eases the pain for a moment. Daniel understood then what Lauren must have understood in her final moments. Hanako didn't want justice, didn't want recognition. The human part of her might have wanted those things once, but 85 years of rage had burned away everything except the need to make others suffer as she'd suffered. She was caught in a loop, replaying her death over and over, and the only brief respite came from forcing others into the loop with her. She was a ghost. Not the bedsheet-wearing Halloween kind, but something far worse. A human soul so damaged by trauma and rage that it had calcified into pure malevolent will. The kind of ghost that every culture warned about. Yurei, Onryo, the vengeful dead who couldn't rest until they dragged enough of the living down with them. And Daniel was about to become her next victim. Unless... His hand went to his pocket, where he carried something he hadn't thought about in 2 years. A small medicine bag, given to him by one of the Macaw searchers after the incident near Ozette. You saw something, the elder had told him. That means you're marked. Carry this. It won't keep them away forever, but it might give you time when you need it. Daniel had laughed it off at the time. Accepted the gift out of politeness. Carried it because it seemed disrespectful not to. Now he pulled it out. Small leather pouch on a cord filled with sage and cedar and tobacco and things he couldn't identify. The Maca elder had called it protection. Told him it worked against spirits who meant harm. Hanako hissed. The sound was nothing human. Nothing Lauren's voice could produce. It came from somewhere deeper than throat or lungs. A sound that resonated in Daniel's bones. Maca magic, Hanako said. And her voice was layered now. Multiple voices speaking in unison, male and female, young and old. They tried that too, in 1923. Tried to bind us, tried to quiet us. All it did was make us angrier. But she didn't come closer. The medicine bag might not stop her, but it seemed to create a boundary she was reluctant to cross. Daniel made a decision. The kind of decision that felt insane even as he made it, but was somehow the only option that made sense. "I can't undo what happened to you," he said. "I can't bring back your father or your brothers or give you the life you should have had. But I can be a different kind of witness." "What does that mean?" "Let me feel it. The memory. What they did. But don't kill me like you killed Lauren. Let me survive it. Let me carry it back. I'll tell your story, not as some academic investigation or historical footnote. I'll tell it as someone who knows, someone who felt it, someone who can make others understand in a way words on a page never could." Hanako tilted her head, hair swaying. "You'd volunteer for that? You know it will break you. Survivors don't come back whole." "I'm already broken." The words came out before Daniel could stop them, but they were true. The Maka search. I saw something there I've never been able to forget. It's been eating at me for 2 years. Maybe this is why. Maybe I was meant to be here, to be your witness. You think this is fate? Hanako's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. You think there's some grand design? No. I think there's just pain trying to find an outlet. And maybe I can be that outlet without dying in the process. Silence. The forest held its breath. Somewhere far away, Daniel could hear voices, the SAR team calling for him. They'd come eventually, following his marked trail. They'd find Lauren's body, and then they'd find him, one way or another. Unless Hanako decided otherwise. The figure considered him for what felt like hours, but was probably less than a minute. Then she nodded just once. "Very well. I will share the memory. But understand, once you know, you can never unknow. It will live in your head forever. You'll dream it. You'll wake up drowning on dry land. You'll hear the river and feel hands holding you under. This is not a gift. This is a curse. I know. Then come closer." Daniel walked forward, each step an act of will. The cold intensified until his muscles screamed in protest. Frost formed on his eyelashes. His breath came in short, painful gasps. Hanako reached out and pressed her palm against his forehead. Her touch was ice and fire and wrongness. Daniel's vision went white. Then he was drowning. Not here. Not now. But then, 1923, late October, the Quino River swollen with autumn rain. He was running through the forest. No, she was running. Hanako was running, 15 years old and terrified. Her father's screams still echoing in her ears, the smell of burning flesh in her nostrils. They were chasing her. White men with axes and hatred and the kind of rage that came from feeling small in a world that was changing too fast. She ran for 3 days, ate berries, drank from streams, hid in hollow trees, prayed to gods she'd been taught in Japan and gods her mother said lived in these American forests, prayed for help that never came. They found her at dawn on the 4th day. 5 of them. She recognized the foreman, the one who'd argued with her father about wages, who'd called them animals and worse. He smiled when he saw her, not happy, satisfied, like checking an item off a list. They didn't rape her. Daniel felt Hanako's relief at that, which made everything worse somehow, that she'd been grateful for that one small mercy. They just dragged her to the river, held her down. The foreman gripped her hair, long black hair even then, and pushed her face into the water. She fought. God, she fought. Clawed at his hands, his arms, anything she could reach. Her fingernails tore away in the struggle, but she kept fighting because what else could she do? She was 15 and drowning, and no one was coming to help. The water filled her lungs, burned. Worse than fire. At least fire killed quickly. This was slow, interminable. Her body convulsed, her vision tunneled, and all she could think was, no one will remember. No one will know. I'm going to die, and it will be like I never existed. That was worse than the physical pain. The erasure, the certainty that her death meant nothing, would change nothing. That the men who killed her would go home and eat dinner and sleep soundly and never face consequences. The memory ended. Daniel collapsed in the present, gasping, his face wet with tears and mucus and water that shouldn't be there but was. His throat burned. His chest ached. His hands were shredded. No, not shredded. That was phantom pain. His hands were fine, but he could still feel the sensation of his own nails tearing away. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. Then louder, "Jesus Christ." He vomited into the moss, retched until nothing came up but bile. Kept retching anyway, his body trying to expel something that wasn't physical, couldn't be expelled. When he finally looked up, Hanako was gone. No, not gone. Fading. He could see through her now, could see the trees behind her translucent form. She looked smaller, more human, more like the 15-year-old girl she'd been. "You understand now?" she said, and her voice was quiet, exhausted. "You felt it?" "Yes." Daniel's voice was raw. "I felt it. I'll never stop feeling it." "Good." A pause. "Tell them. Tell everyone. Make them understand what was taken." "I will. I promise." "Promises." Hanako laughed softly. "But yours feels different. Less empty. Maybe because you paid the price to make it." She raised one translucent hand in something that might have been a wave or a blessing or a goodbye. "I can rest now, just for a little while. The memory isn't only mine anymore. That helps. That eases the pressure." "Will you come back?" Daniel asked. "After you rest?" "Eventually. The rage won't stay quiet forever. But maybe there will be longer gaps between hauntings. Maybe someday there will be enough witnesses that I can finally sleep." She faded completely then, leaving Daniel alone in the forest with the marks of drowning on his throat and the taste of river water in his mouth, and the absolute certainty that he would never be the same. The SAR team found him 20 minutes later, sitting beside Lauren's body, staring at nothing. He told them about finding her, about the old logging camp and the grave markers. He gave them the GPS coordinates and his camera with its photos. The camera mysteriously working again, battery showing full charge. He didn't tell them about Hanako, not then. How could he? How do you explain something like that in a way that doesn't get you put on psychological leave? But he would tell them, eventually. He'd tell everyone. That was his job now, his purpose. Hanako's witness. They brought Lauren's body out 2 days later, after the medical examiner did a field examination. Cause of death: drowning. Somehow, impossibly, she'd drowned in a forest miles from any body of water deep enough. The ME noted water in her lungs, fresh water, consistent with the Kino River. No one could explain how it got there. Daniel could have explained. Didn't. Not yet. He stayed on as a ranger at Olympic National Park, requested assignment to the Kinault River drainage specifically. He visits the old logging camp every month, leaves offerings at the grave markers, sage, tobacco, rice, sake, things the Maka elder told him spirits appreciated. And every year on October 17th, the date Hanako died, the date he finally found in historical records after weeks of research, he sits beside her unmarked spot and tells her story to the empty forest. Sometimes he brings students, history majors writing theses on labor conflicts in Pacific Northwest logging camps, journalists covering stories about historical injustices, activists fighting for recognition of anti-Asian violence. He shows them the markers, tells them about 6 Japanese loggers killed in 1923, about a 15-year-old girl murdered to keep her silent, about 85 years of rage and erasure. He tells them what happened to Lauren, how she died trying to bear witness, how witnessing isn't passive, isn't safe, isn't something you walk away from unchanged. He doesn't tell them that he drowns in his dreams every night, that he wakes up gasping, hands clawing at his throat, the taste of river water in his mouth. That's his burden to carry, his price for survival. He doesn't tell them that sometimes, on foggy mornings in the valley, he sees a figure in white standing at the tree line, watching, waiting, resting until the rage builds again and she needs another witness. He doesn't tell them that he knows, with the certainty that comes from having lived someone else's death, that there are things in these mountains older than nations, deeper than soil, more patient than stone, things that remember, things that wait, things that hunger for the one thing more powerful than death, to be remembered. Daniel Reeves stays at his post. He tells Hanako's story. He bears witness. And when the time comes when she needs another voice, another vessel for her rage, he'll be there, ready, willing. Because some promises once made can't be broken without breaking yourself. And Daniel has been broken enough times to know there are worse things than drowning. The worst thing is to drown alone, unmourned, forgotten. He won't let that happen to Hanako again, even if it costs him everything. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened in that forest. Ryan Shepard had never believed in ghosts, and at 34, with 8 years as a ranger in North Cascades National Park under his belt, he'd seen enough to know that every supernatural occurrence had a rational explanation. The strange sounds in the forest were always wildlife. The eerie feelings of being watched were evolutionary holdovers, the brain's pattern recognition software misfiring. The local legends about the old mining settlements scattered through the Cascade Pass area were just that. Legends, stories told by people who needed mystery to make their isolated lives more interesting. He said as much to Deputy Ranger Marcus Chen on the morning of October 14, 2009, when Marcus mentioned that some of the seasonal workers had been talking about bad feelings near the abandoned settlement of Johannesburg, 6 miles up the Cascade River Trail. Ryan was at his desk in the Marble Mount Ranger Station, filling out equipment requisition forms on the aging Dell desktop that took 3 minutes to boot up. The government budget cuts had hit the park hard that year, one of many casualties of the economic collapse that had dominated the news for months. Bad feelings, Ryan repeated, not looking up from the screen. His tone made it clear what he thought of bad feelings. Tell them to save the campfire stories for tourists. Marcus, who was 23 and still green enough to take things seriously, shifted uncomfortably. I know how it sounds, but Jenny said she heard something up there last week, singing in Romanian or something. Said it made her physically sick to her stomach. Jenny's from Portland and thinks anything east of I-5 is deliverance country, Ryan said, finally glancing up. Probably heard someone's radio, or a fox. You ever hear a fox scream? Sounds like someone being murdered. I know what a fox sounds like, Marcus said, a little defensively. This was different, she said, like words, but wrong somehow. Ryan saved his document and leaned back in his chair, which squeaked in protest. The station smelled like burnt coffee and the pine-scented air freshener that the summer volunteer had bought with her own money, because the Park Service wasn't going to pay for such luxuries. Outside the window, October rain fell steadily, turning the parking lot into a mirror of gray sky. Marcus, I'm going to tell you something that's going to save you a lot of headaches in this job. People love to be scared. They come out here looking for the wilderness experience, and when they get it, when they're actually alone in the dark with no cell signal and no Starbucks, their brains start inventing things to be scared of. It's not malicious. It's just human nature. But what if... There's no what if, Ryan interrupted, but not unkindly. He'd been that young once, that uncertain. There's only what is. And what is that we've got a missing person report that came in at 600 this morning, and we need to focus on that instead of ghost stories. The missing person was named Kayla Morrison, 28, solo hiker from Bellingham, who'd been due back 3 days ago from a week-long trip through the Cascade Pass area. Her roommate had finally called it in after trying Kayla's cell phone 47 times with no answer. Ryan had the report printed out in front of him. Experienced hiker, proper gear listed on her backcountry permit, sensible route planned. The last confirmed sighting was at the Cascade River trailhead on October 7th, where the volunteer camp host had noted her departure at approximately 8:15 a.m. What bothered Ryan, not scared him, he didn't get scared, but bothered him in the way that a puzzle with missing pieces bothered him, was that Kayla Morrison's planned route took her directly past Johannesburg. The settlement wasn't on any modern maps. It had been established in 1903 by Romanian and Hungarian immigrants lured west by promises of gold and silver in the Cascade Mountains. The promises had been lies, or at least severe exaggerations. By 1907, the settlement was abandoned, the miners having either died in the brutal winters, given up and moved on, or, according to local folklore, simply vanished. The few remaining structures had been consumed by forest decades ago, though if you knew where to look, you could still find the cemetery, a dozen weathered headstones with names carved in Cyrillic and Latin scripts. Ryan knew where to look because he'd done a historical survey of the area 2 years ago, part of a Park Service initiative to document abandoned settlements before they were completely erased by time and vegetation. He'd photographed the headstones, noting the odd concentration of death dates in the winter of 1906-1907. Probably a flu outbreak or typhoid. Disease ravaged these isolated communities. He pulled up the digital photos now, scanning through them with the clinical detachment of someone examining historical data. Gheorghe Popa died January 1907, age 42. Maria Iancu died February 1907, age 19. Ion Dumitru died January 1907, age 37. The dates clustered together like a mass casualty event. The inscriptions were mostly in Romanian, but one headstone had a longer inscription in English that he'd found particularly morbid at the time. Here lies Pavel Stănescu, who returned when he should not have. May God have mercy on his corrupted soul. The silver stake holds him still. Ryan had assumed it was a reference to alcoholism or some moral failing. Mining camps were rough places after all. But the phrase, "the silver stake holds him still," had a strange specificity to it that had lodged in his memory like a splinter. He closed the photos and pulled up the topographic map on his screen, plotting Kayla Morrison's route. She would have passed within a quarter-mile of the cemetery, would have camped somewhere in that vicinity on her second or third night out. The trail there ran through old-growth forest, dense enough that the understory remained in perpetual twilight even at noon. Cell reception was non-existent. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could twist an ankle, break a leg, become hypothermic in the October chill. It was exactly the kind of place where someone could die. "Get the SAR gear ready," Ryan told Marcus, already reaching for his radio. "We're going in at first light tomorrow. I want to check the trail registers first, see if anyone else reported seeing her." Marcus nodded and headed for the equipment room, but paused at the door. "Ryan, that cemetery you documented up there. Jenny said she found fresh flowers on one of the graves, like, from this year fresh." Ryan's fingers stilled on his keyboard. "Which grave?" She didn't remember the name. Said it was one with a weird inscription. Something about a stake. The rational part of Ryan's brain, which was most of his brain, immediately generated explanations. Descendant visiting ancestral grave. History enthusiast. Random hiker who thought it would be romantic. But another part, a part he tried very hard not to acknowledge, remembered standing in that cemetery 2 years ago in the thin September sunlight. Remembered the way the temperature had dropped suddenly. Remembered the way his breath had misted despite the warmth of the day. Remembered the feeling of being watched by something that did not mean well. He'd written it off at the time as the power of suggestion, the eeriness of abandoned graves and deep wilderness playing tricks on his perception. He was writing it off now too, but with slightly less conviction. "Probably a descendant," he said aloud, and Marcus agreed, and they moved on to logistics and equipment checks and the 1,000 mundane details of organizing a search and rescue operation. But that night, alone in his cabin 5 miles outside the park boundary, Ryan found himself Googling Pavel Stănescu and Johannesburg mining camp and silver stake. He found nothing, of course, except a few scattered references to the settlement in historical mining records. The internet in 2009 wasn't the comprehensive archive it would become. It was still a patchwork of isolated information, and the history of a failed mining camp in the Cascades wasn't exactly high-priority digitization material. But he did find something else, buried on the 3rd page of search results. A scanned excerpt from a 1932 edition of the Seattle Post-Intelligencer newspaper. It was part of a series on ghost towns of the Northwest, and the entry on Johannesburg was brief but unsettling. The settlement of Johannesburg, established 1903 and abandoned by 1908, stands as a grim reminder of the hardships faced by immigrant miners in the Cascade Wilderness. Local Skagit tribe members avoid the area, citing old warnings about hungry dead who could not rest. Several hikers in the 1920s reported disturbing experiences near the settlement, including the disappearance of James Mackenzie in 1924 and Sarah Holbrook in 1927, whose bodies were never recovered despite extensive searches. The area remains remote and dangerous, and travelers are advised to exercise caution. Ryan stared at the screen for a long time. James Mackenzie, 1924. Sarah Holbrook, 1927. He opened a new search window and started digging through old Park Service records, missing persons reports, incident logs. The file system was a mess. Records scattered across multiple databases and formats, some dating back to handwritten logs that had been poorly scanned and incompletely indexed. But he found them, more of them than there should have been. 1924. James Mackenzie, age 31, vanished near Cascade Pass. Last seen on trail to Johannesburg area. 1927. Sarah Holbrook, age 24, disappeared during solo hiking trip. Tent found abandoned near old mining settlement. No sign of struggle. 1933. Robert Chen, age 42, failed to return from prospecting trip. Search found his equipment scattered near cemetery, but no body. 1956. Linda Kowalski, age 29, missing after reporting strange singing on radio to ranger station. Last known position near Johannesburg. 1973. Thomas Brennan, age 35, vanished. Hiking partner reported Brennan became obsessed with old cemetery, insisted on camping there despite partner's objections. Partner woke to find Brennan gone. 1989. Michelle Tran, age 31, disappeared. Journal found an abandoned backpack described feeling followed and terrible dreams of hungry eyes. The dates went on. A grim chronology spanning 8 decades, 22 disappearances in total, spread across the years but all clustering around the same area, all sharing certain consistencies. Solo hikers or hikers separated from their groups, ages ranging from 24 to 45, most in the late 20s to early 30s. And in the reports where details were preserved, unsettling commonalities emerged. Descriptions of singing or chanting, complaints of feeling watched, mentions of the cemetery, reports of vivid nightmares. Ryan sat back from his laptop, the glow of the screen harsh in his dark cabin. Outside, the October wind moved through the Douglas firs with a sound like rushing water. His coffee had gone cold in its mug, forgotten. 22 people. And now possibly Kayla Morrison made 23. The rational explanations lined up obediently in his mind. The area was remote and dangerous. Accidents happened, bears happened, hypothermia happened. People fell off cliffs or drowned in the frigid streams, or simply got lost and died of exposure. The wilderness killed people. That was a fact. It didn't need supernatural assistance. But 23 people in roughly the same square mile of wilderness across 8 decades, all exhibiting similar behaviors before disappearing. The statistical odds of that were... He didn't know what the statistical odds were, but his gut told him they weren't good. His gut also told him that he should call in sick tomorrow, let Marcus lead the SAR operation, stay as far away from Johannesburg and its cemetery, and its impossible concentration of vanished hikers as possible. But Ryan Shepard didn't believe in ghosts, and he wasn't about to let irrational fear, because that's all it was, irrational fear dressed up in pattern recognition, interfere with his job. A woman was missing. That was the reality. Everything else was superstition and coincidence. He shut the laptop and went to bed, and that night he dreamed of singing in a language he didn't understand, and of hunger that had no bottom, and of something standing at the foot of his bed with eyes that reflected the moonlight like an animal's eyes. But the shape was all wrong, too tall and too angular and too still. He woke at 4:47 a.m. according to the red numbers on his alarm clock, his heart slamming against his ribs, his mouth dry. The cabin was empty and dark and normal. Just a dream, just his subconscious processing the disturbing information he'd uncovered, turning it into nightmare fuel. That's what dreams did. He got up, took a shower so hot it left his skin pink, and dressed in his ranger uniform. Olive green pants, gray shirt with the National Park Service arrowhead patch on the shoulder. He made coffee strong enough to strip paint and ate cereal standing at his counter, watching through the kitchen window as the October dawn bled gray light across the mountains. At the ranger station, Marcus was already loading the SAR packs into the Park Service Ford F-250. They had the standard gear: first aid kit, rescue blanket, rope, carabiners, flares, GPS unit, a Garmin E-Trex that was already 3 years old and not particularly reliable in the dense forest, extra batteries, water, food, the Motorola radios that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't. Ryan added his personal gear: a topographic map marked with Kayla Morrison's planned route, a compass, his digital camera, and on an impulse he didn't fully understand, a printout of the historical information about Johannesburg, including the photo of Pavel Stanescu's headstone with its warning about silver stakes. Marcus noticed the printout. Research? Context, Ryan said, which wasn't quite a lie. They drove to the Cascade River trailhead, 23 miles of increasingly rough road that tested the Ford's suspension. The rain had stopped, but the clouds hung low and heavy, turning the forest into shades of gray and green and shadow. At the trailhead, Ryan checked the register. Kayla Morrison had signed in on October 7th at 8:15 a.m., just as the camp host had reported. Her handwriting was neat and confident. Cascade Pass Loop, 7 days, solo, experienced, all gear. No one else had signed in or out in the 4 days since. They shouldered their packs and started up the trail. Marcus was young and fit and set a strong pace, but Ryan had experience in pacing, and within the first mile he'd established the rhythm that would carry them through the day. The trail was in decent condition, well maintained, marked with the occasional orange diamond on trees where the path might be ambiguous. The forest pressed in on both sides, dense and dripping with residual rain. Mushrooms fruited from fallen logs and exotic formations. Moss covered everything like green fur. They hiked for 3 hours before reaching the first potential camping site along Kayla's route, a flat area near a creek where the fire ring and cleared tent sites showed heavy use. No sign of Kayla. They continued on, checking each potential campsite, calling her name at regular intervals, watching for any indication of human passage off trail. The day wore on, and the gray light dimmed toward afternoon, and they found nothing. At 4 p.m., Ryan called a halt at a campsite 2 miles from the Johannesburg area. They'd covered 12 miles, and his knees were informing him that he was 34, not 24. They set up their tent, boiled water for freeze-dried meals, and spread the topo map across Ryan's lap to plan the next day's search. If she stuck to her plan, she would have been in the Johannesburg area on the 3rd or 4th night, Ryan said, tracing the route with his finger. That's where we concentrate tomorrow. Marcus nodded, chewing on a mouthful of reconstituted beef stroganoff. What do you think happened? Probably injury, Ryan said automatically. Twisted ankle, maybe a fall. She gets hurt, can't continue, sets up camp and waits for help. Her phone's dead by now. She's cold and hungry, but probably okay if we find her tomorrow. Right, Marcus said. But he didn't sound convinced, and Ryan realized with some discomfort that he didn't sound convinced either. They finished their meals as darkness settled over the forest with the weight of a physical presence. Ryan tried the Motorola radio, raising the ranger station. The signal was weak, but present. He reported their position and their plan for tomorrow, then signed off. The radio's battery indicator showed 3 bars out of 5. The GPS was at 4 bars. Everything was fine. Everything was manageable. Marcus set up the portable camp stove to heat water for coffee, and in the hiss of the butane flame and the rattle of water beginning to boil, Ryan heard something else. Something distant and thin and winding between the trees like smoke. He held up his hand and Marcus fell silent, and they both listened. Singing. Or something like singing. The melody was there, rising and falling in patterns that suggested structure and intention. But the quality of it was wrong. The voice, if it was a voice, had a grating texture, like wet rust, and the language was nothing Ryan recognized. What the hell is that? Marcus whispered. Ryan's brain offered explanations. Wind through rocks, a bird call distorted by distance and acoustics, someone else camping nearby playing music. But none of those explanations felt right, and the hairs on his forearms were standing up in a way that had nothing to do with cold. "Could be another camper," he said. But even as he spoke, the singing cut off with an abruptness that was somehow worse than the sound itself. The silence that followed was total. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the hiss of the camp stove and the hammering of Ryan's pulse in his ears. "Should we investigate?" Marcus asked. And Ryan heard the hope in his voice that the answer would be no. "Not in the dark," Ryan said. "If there's another camper out there, they're not in distress. If it's wildlife, we don't want to stumble into it blind. We stay put, stay alert, and we check it out at first light." They maintained watch in 2-hour shifts through the night. Nothing else disturbed them, but Ryan couldn't shake the feeling of being observed, of eyes in the darkness weighing and measuring and calculating. When his shift ended and Marcus took over, Ryan lay in his sleeping bag staring at the tent's ceiling, listening to every sound, unable to escape the mounting conviction that coming here had been a terrible mistake. Morning arrived with fog so thick that visibility dropped to 20 feet. They broke camp in silence, both moving with the careful efficiency of people who wanted to be done and gone as quickly as possible. The trail to Johannesburg was overgrown, marked on Ryan's GPS but barely visible on the ground. They had to follow game trails and compass bearings, pushing through salal and huckleberry bushes that soaked their pants with accumulated dew. The cemetery appeared suddenly, materializing from the fog like a photograph developing. The headstones were exactly as Ryan remembered from 2 years ago. Weathered granite and limestone, Cyrillic inscriptions, dates from the early 1900s. But something had changed. Several of the graves had fresh earth around them, as if they'd been disturbed recently. And on Pavel Stanescu's headstone, someone had placed a bouquet of wildflowers so fresh that water droplets still clung to the petals. Ryan approached slowly, his boots squelching in the wet ground. Marcus hung back, his hand on the radio at his belt, his face pale. The inscription on Stanescu's headstone was clear even after a century of weathering. "The silver stake holds him still." "Someone's been here," Marcus said, his voice tight. "Recently." "Looks like," Ryan agreed, crouching to examine the flowers. Alpine asters and paintbrush, species that grew wild in the area, picked within the last day or two. "Maybe a descendant. Maybe." He stopped, because on the ground next to the flowers, pressed into the soft earth, was a boot print, a small boot print. Women's size 7 or 8, with the distinctive tread pattern of Merrill hiking boots. Merrill boots were what Kayla Morrison had listed on her gear inventory. "Marcus," Ryan said quietly, "look at this." The younger ranger knelt beside him, examined the print, and when understanding hit him, his face went from pale to ashen. "That's her. That's got to be her." "Boot print doesn't mean anything conclusive," Ryan said, even though his own heart was racing. "Lots of people wear Merrills." But even as he said it, he was scanning the ground, and there were more prints. Not many, and smudged by rain and time, but enough to trace a path from the cemetery toward the forest's edge. Ryan stood and followed them, Marcus close behind. The prints led to a cluster of mature cedars where the canopy was thick enough that the ground underneath was relatively dry. And there, in the shelter of the largest cedar, was a tent. It was a green REI backpacking tent, 1-person size, and the rain fly was pulled tight against the morning's dampness. No movement came from inside. No sound. "Kayla?" Ryan called. "Kayla Morrison?" Nothing. He approached the tent, his pulse hammering in his throat. The zipper on the fly was closed, as was the main tent door underneath. Through the semi-transparent nylon, he could make out the shape of a sleeping bag, and inside the sleeping bag, something that might have been a person. "Kayla, this is Park Service. We're here to help. Can you hear me?" No response. Ryan reached for the zipper pull, hesitated, then pulled it down in one quick motion. The sound was unnaturally loud in the fog-muffled forest. He opened the tent flap and looked inside. The smell hit him first. copper and rot and something else, something sweet and wrong. The sleeping bag was occupied, but the person inside was not asleep. Could not sleep, could not do anything anymore. Ryan had seen death before. He'd recovered drowning victims from rivers, found hikers who died of heart attacks on trails, helped process the aftermath of climbing accidents. He knew what death looked like. But this was different. The body in the sleeping bag was Kayla Morrison, or had been. The driver's license photo in the missing persons report matched the basic features. Long brown hair, narrow face, small build. But something had been done to her, something that Ryan's mind struggled to process. Her skin had a gray, waxy appearance, and her lips were pulled back from her teeth in a grimace that showed more gum than should have been visible. Her eyes were open, filmed over, staring at nothing. But worse than that, far worse, were the wounds on her neck. 2 puncture marks, ragged and deep, surrounded by bruising so dark it looked black. And the area around the wounds was sunken, collapsed, as if something had drawn out not just blood but everything beneath the skin, leaving only a hollow shell. Marcus made a sound behind him, a choked gasp that might have been the prelude to vomiting. Ryan backed away from the tent, his hands shaking, his carefully maintained composure fracturing. "Radio the station," he said, his voice coming out hoarse. Get a body recovery team up here. Tell them we found her. Tell them..." He stopped because he didn't know what to tell them. That she'd been attacked by an animal? The wounds weren't consistent with any predator he knew. Bear attacks were violent, involved claws and tearing. Cougar attacks focused on the skull and spine. This was surgical, precise, focused on the neck. That she'd been murdered? Possibly, but by who? And why? And how did they vanish into the wilderness without leaving tracks? Marcus fumbled with the radio, his hands shaking so badly he almost dropped it. The signal was weak, crackling with static, but he managed to raise the station and report the situation in a voice that kept cracking. While he did that, Ryan forced himself to document the scene, taking photos with his digital camera, noting the position of the tent, the condition of the surrounding area. Professional detachment. That's what he needed. Focus on the job. But his professional detachment shattered completely when he looked at Pavel Stanescu's headstone again and saw that the flowers were gone. The wild flowers that had been there 5 minutes ago, fresh and damp, were simply no longer present. And the boot prints leading from the cemetery to Kayla's tent were fading, sinking back into the earth as he watched, as if the ground itself was swallowing the evidence. "Marcus," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Marcus, look at the headstone." The young ranger turned from the radio, saw what Ryan was seeing, or rather wasn't seeing, and went perfectly still. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Then Marcus said very carefully, "The flowers were there. I saw them. You saw them." "I know. Where did they go?" "I don't know." "Ryan, what the fuck is happening here?" Ryan didn't answer because he didn't have an answer that made sense. Or rather, he had an answer, but it was an answer his rational mind rejected absolutely. Ghosts weren't real. The supernatural didn't exist. There had to be an explanation. But as he stood there in the fog-shrouded cemetery, with a corpse that bore impossible wounds in a tent behind him and flowers that had vanished from a grave in front of him, his certainty began to crack. The radio crackled. The station was sending a recovery team, but it would take them at least 6 hours to reach this location. Ryan and Marcus were to secure the scene and wait. Standard procedure. Except nothing about this was standard. They moved Kayla's tent, zipped it closed to protect the body from scavengers. Though some part of Ryan's mind whispered that scavengers weren't the threat here. They set up their own camp 100 yards away, close enough to maintain their duty but far enough to escape the smell. The fog refused to lift, and the silence of the forest remained absolute. No birds, no insects, no wind, just the sound of their own breathing and the occasional snap of twigs under their boots as they paced nervously around their campsite. "Tell me about Johannesburg," Marcus said as afternoon crawled toward evening. "You did research on it, right?" Ryan pulled out the printouts he'd brought, the historical information. the old newspaper article about the hungry dead. He explained what he'd found: the concentration of deaths in 1906, 1907, the disappearances over the subsequent decades, the warnings from the Skaget tribe. He showed Marcus the photo of Pavel Stanescu's headstone with its inscription about silver stakes. "Strigoi," Marcus said suddenly. Ryan looked up. "What?" "Strigoi. That's what they called vampires in Romania. My roommate in college was from Bucharest. He told me stories. Said his grandmother wouldn't let anyone in the family die without putting certain rituals in place. Garlic in the coffin, a silver coin in the mouth. And for people who'd done terrible things in life, they'd drive a stake through the heart. Silver stake, sometimes iron, to keep them from rising again." "That's folklore," Ryan said, but his voice lacked conviction. "So are singing dead people and disappearing flowers," Marcus shot back. "But we just saw those." Ryan wanted to argue, wanted to marshal his rational explanations, wanted to prove that there was a logical solution, but his certainty was gone, eroded by too many impossible things, replaced by a creeping dread that settled into his bones like cold. "If we're dealing with a strigoi," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the manic edge of someone trying to solve an unsolvable problem, "then the folklore has rules. They're strongest at night. They drink blood, but also drain life energy. They can influence minds, create illusions. They return to their graves during the day. And they can be killed, actually killed, if the body is exhumed and destroyed. Decapitation, burning, stake through the heart." "We're not digging up graves," Ryan said flatly. "I'm not saying we should. I'm just telling you what the lore says." They fell silent. The afternoon faded. The recovery team was still hours away. Ryan checked his GPS battery. 2 bars. The radio. 2 bars. His phone had no signal and wouldn't have one out here regardless. They were running out of power, running out of light, and running out of time. At dusk, the singing started again. It came from the direction of the cemetery. That same wrong voice with its rusted nail texture. Words in Romanian that Ryan couldn't understand but that made his skin prickle with instinctive revulsion. Marcus went rigid, his hand dropping to the canister of bear spray on his belt, a useless gesture against something that might not be alive in any conventional sense. "We should leave," Marcus whispered. "We should leave right now." "We can't leave the body," Ryan said, though every fiber of his being agreed with Marcus's assessment. "The hell with the body. Ryan, something is wrong here. Something is really, really wrong, and we need to—" Marcus stopped mid-sentence, his eyes going wide. Ryan turned to follow his gaze and saw a figure standing at the edge of their campsite, just visible in the failing light. It was a woman. She wore hiking clothes, dirty and torn, and her long brown hair hung lank around her face. For a moment, Ryan's mind insisted it was Kayla Morrison, that she'd survived somehow, that everything was fine. But then the figure stepped closer, and he saw that it was not Kayla. The face was wrong, the proportions off, and the eyes caught the last of the daylight and reflected it back like an animal's eyes, flat and cold and empty of anything Ryan would recognize as human thought. "Foam," the figure said, and the voice was the singing voice, rusted and wrong. "Foam, Veshnika, hunger eternal." It smiled, and its teeth were all wrong. Too long, too sharp, set in gums that had receded to show bone. And Ryan finally understood what he was seeing, though his mind screamed in protest. Not a living woman, not even a corpse. Something in between, something that had died but refused to stay dead. Something animated by hunger that could never be satisfied. Strigoi. The creature took another step forward, impossibly silent despite the debris on the forest floor. Marcus raised the bear spray with shaking hands, and the strigoi laughed, a sound like grinding metal. "Argent," it said, one skeletal finger pointing at Pavel Stanescu's grave, barely visible through the trees. "Argent Matina, dar alții sunt liberi. Others are free." And then it moved, faster than anything human could move, closing the distance between them in a blur of motion that Ryan's eyes couldn't track. He felt cold hands on his shoulders, smelled rot and copper, felt breath that wasn't breath on his neck. The world spun and he hit the ground hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs. Through dimming vision, he saw Marcus spraying the bear spray directly into the Strigoy's face with no effect whatsoever. Saw the creature backhanding Marcus casually, sending him flying into a tree trunk with a crack that might have been wood or bone. Saw it crouch over him with hunger in those dead eyes. Saw its mouth opening impossibly wide, revealing a throat that went down and down into darkness. And then Ryan felt teeth on his neck, felt the sharp pain of penetration, felt something being drawn out of him that wasn't just blood. His vision grayed at the edges. His thoughts scattered like birds. This was death. This was how it ended. In a fog-shrouded forest, killed by something that shouldn't exist. Everything he believed in and built his life on revealed as hollow comfort against the actual darkness of the world. But the Strigoi stopped, pulled back, hissed in frustration, and Ryan, consciousness fading, saw why. A thin silver chain had fallen out of his shirt collar, a chain with a small silver cross that his grandmother had given him 20 years ago, that he'd worn without thinking about, without even remembering it was there. A thoughtless gesture to please a dying relative that he'd never believed had any meaning. Argent, the Strigoi spat, recoiling from the cross as if it were fire. Argent blestemat. It backed away, still hissing, and melted into the darkness. Ryan lay on the ground, his hand pressed to his neck, feeling wet warmth that was his blood, but not enough blood, not a fatal amount. The creature had been interrupted before it could finish. Marcus groaned from where he'd fallen. Ryan dragged himself over, checked for pulse, found it strong despite the blood on Marcus's temple. The young ranger's eyes fluttered open. What? What happened? We're leaving, Ryan said, his voice hoarse. Right now. We're leaving right fucking now. He hauled Marcus to his feet, ignoring the protests from his own abused body. They grabbed only the essentials: radios, GPS, water, first aid, abandoning everything else. The Strigoi was still out there somewhere, and Pavel Stanescu's grave might hold one creature, but Marcus had said others were free, which meant they were surrounded by hungry dead in a cemetery full of graves from 1906-1907. Graves of miners who died in an outbreak that maybe wasn't flu or typhoid at all. They ran, stumbled really, through the fog and the darkness, following the GPS coordinates back toward the main trail, back toward safety and light, and the world where things like Strigoi didn't exist. Behind them, the singing started up again, joined by other voices, a chorus of hungry dead calling into the night. Ryan's neck burned where he'd been bitten. His head swam with blood loss and terror and the complete collapse of his worldview. Marcus kept pace beside him, limping but moving, both of them driven by pure survival instinct. The GPS led them through nightmare forest, every shadow potentially concealing another creature, every sound potentially announcing their death. They reached the main trail 3 hours later, both near collapse. The fog had lifted slightly and the moon provided enough light to see by. Ryan checked his neck. 2 puncture wounds, not deep, already clotting. He would live. They would both live. The recovery team found them at dawn, hypothermic and delirious and babbling about vampires and silver crosses and singing corpses. They were airlifted to the hospital in Cedro Woolley, treated for exposure and minor injuries, and questioned extensively by Park Service investigators. Ryan told them the truth. Kayla Morrison was dead. Her body was in a tent near the abandoned cemetery at Johannesburg, and something had attacked them in the night. He showed them the bite marks on his neck. When they pressed for details about the attacker, he said he didn't know. It was dark. They'd been disoriented. He didn't mention the Strigoi, didn't mention the singing or the disappearing flowers or the impossible speed of the creature. Because who would believe him? He barely believed it himself, and he'd lived through it. Kayla Morrison's body was recovered 3 days later. The official cause of death was listed as animal attack, species undetermined. The case was closed. Ryan was put on administrative leave for 2 weeks to recover. He never went back. He submitted his resignation on November 1st, 2009, citing personal reasons. He moved to Seattle, took a job doing data entry for a tech company, something inside, something with fluorescent lights and locked doors and no wilderness. He stopped hiking, stopped camping, Stopped going anywhere that didn't have cell phone signal and police response within 5 minutes. But the nightmares continued. Every night he dreamed of singing in Romanian, of eyes that reflected light like an animal's, of hunger that had no bottom and no end. Every night he woke with his hand on his neck, feeling for puncture wounds that had healed months ago, but somehow still felt present. And sometimes in the darkest hours before dawn, he would remember Pavel Stănescu's grave with its inscription about silver stakes, would remember Marcus saying that Strigoi could be killed if their bodies were destroyed, would remember the creature saying, "Others are free," in its rusted nail voice. The cemetery at Johannesburg held 12 graves. Pavel Stănescu's body was held by a silver stake. But what about the other 11? What about the miners who'd died in that long-ago winter, who'd been buried without the proper rituals, who'd perhaps risen again as hungry dead and then been abandoned when the settlement collapsed, left to haunt the forest for a century, feeding on the occasional hiker who wandered too close to their graves? 22 disappearances over 80 years. And now Kayla Morrison made 23. Ryan tried not to think about who would be number 24, but on March 15, 2010, his phone rang at 3 in the morning. It was Marcus Chen, who'd also left the Park Service, who now worked as a fire lookout in eastern Washington, where the forests were thin and dry and nothing could hide in shadows. "Ryan," Marcus said, his voice tight with fear. "I got a call from Jenny. She's leading a SAR operation. Someone went missing near Johannesburg, a solo hiker, 29-year-old woman. She's been gone for 4 days." Ryan didn't say anything, couldn't say anything, because he knew how this ended. He'd seen how it ended. "They asked if I'd come help with the search," Marcus continued. "They said you were the expert on that area. Asked if you'd come too." "No," Ryan said. "Ryan, someone's missing. Someone's going to die if we don't." "Someone's already dead," Ryan interrupted. "They've been dead for 100 years. We can't save them. We can't fight them. All we can do is stay away and hope they stay in their cemetery and that people stop hiking through there. So we just let it happen? We let them keep killing? What's the alternative?" Ryan asked. "We go back there? We dig up those graves? We're not equipped for that. We're not trained for that. Hell, I don't even believe in that, and I saw it with my own eyes." Marcus was silent for a long time. Then he said, "I'm going. Whether you come or not, I'm going. Someone has to stop this. Marcus." But Marcus had already hung up. Ryan never saw Marcus Chen again. The young ranger disappeared on March 20th, 2010, during a search and rescue operation near an abandoned mining settlement called Johannesburg. His body was never recovered. The official report listed him as lost to the wilderness, probable fatal accident. Ryan knew better. He still lives in Seattle, still works his data entry job, still wakes every night from dreams of singing and hunger, and sometimes, on particularly dark nights, he considers going back. Considers finishing what Marcus tried to start. Considers bringing silver stakes and holy water and whatever else the folklore says works against Strigoi. Considers exhuming those graves and burning the bodies and ending the curse. But he never does. Because he's seen those eyes in the darkness, felt those cold hands, tasted that copper and rot. And he knows that some hungers cannot be satisfied, some dead cannot be killed, and some places are meant to be left alone. The forest keeps its secrets. The hungry dead keep their graves. And somewhere in the North Cascades, near a cemetery that no map shows, the singing continues. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what really happened at Johannesburg. Daniel Reeves had seen enough missing person cases to recognize the pattern of panic in a father's voice, but he'd also seen enough to know that panic rarely meant anything supernatural. 23 years as a National Park Service ranger had taught him that the wilderness didn't need ghosts or monsters to kill people. Hypothermia, dehydration, and human stupidity did the job efficiently enough. The Beaver float plane touched down on Rock Harbor with the kind of graceless bounce that reminded Daniel why he hated early November crossings to Isle Royale. pilot, a weathered man named Kowalski who'd been flying supplies to the island since the 80s, cut the engine and turned back with an expression that Daniel had learned to read as concern masquerading as professional detachment. "Weather Service says we've got maybe 36 hours before the next system rolls in," Kowalski said, pulling off his headset. "You find this Tyler kid, or you don't. I'm pulling out Tuesday morning. I'm not getting caught on this rock when that front hits." Daniel nodded, already mentally cataloging his gear. Garmin E-Trex GPS unit, the 2009 model with the slightly unreliable satellite acquisition that had caused problems on his last backcountry assignment. Motorola two-way radio with batteries that would last 48 hours if he was conservative with transmissions. Standard SR pack with thermal emergency bivy, water purification tablets, first aid kit with pressure bandages, and hemostatic gauze. Everything by the book, everything rational, everything explainable. The park superintendent, Margaret Chen, met him at the dock with a folder thick enough to suggest this wasn't the routine recovery operation the initial call had implied. She was a compact woman in her 50s, the kind of administrator who'd spent enough years in the field to maintain calluses on her hands and a permanent squint from decades of sun exposure. "Tyler Jameson, 24, experienced backpacker," she said without preamble, leading him toward the ranger station. "Checked in at Rock Harbor 7 days ago, filed a solo itinerary for the Greenstone Ridge Trail to Wendigo. Should have been a 4-day hike. He's 3 days overdue and his father is losing his mind in Houghton." Daniel took the folder, flipping through incident reports, medical history, a photocopy of Tyler's wilderness permit. The photograph showed a young man with the kind of confident smile that came from too many successful summits and not enough experience with genuine danger. Solo in November. Smart. He had winter camping experience. Rainier, Denali Base Camp, the Presidential Range in February. Margaret's tone carried the defensive edge of someone who'd already second-guessed the decision to issue the permit. "We've had solos on the island this late before. Not for 3 years we haven't." Daniel closed the folder. "Not since the Hendricks disappearance, I know." Margaret's expression tightened in a way that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had made the connection. "Which is why I need you to find this kid fast and shut down whatever conspiracy theories are already brewing on the mainland." Daniel felt something shift in his chest. Not concern exactly, but the particular irritation he reserved for coincidences that people insisted on treating as patterns. Hendricks was a drunk who fell through ice. The medical examiner confirmed it. The medical examiner confirmed drowning. The blood alcohol level was inconclusive because the body spent 2 weeks in 40-degree water. Margaret unlocked the station door, gesturing him inside. But yes, officially, Thomas Hendricks died of accidental drowning, complicated by hypothermia and intoxication. Officially. Daniel dropped his pack on the briefing table, already recognizing the shape of the conversation. "Let me guess. Unofficially, someone found something weird." Margaret pulled a second folder from her desk drawer, this one noticeably thinner and marked with a post-it note reading, "Personnel only, not for public record." She hesitated for just a moment before sliding it across the table. Unofficially, Thomas Hendricks was found with tissue damage inconsistent with standard cold water drowning. The examiner noted what she called irregular consumption patterns around the extremities. Fingers and toes showed signs of being gnawed, possibly by scavengers, but the marks didn't match any known animal in the Lake Superior ecosystem. Daniel opened the folder and immediately wished he hadn't. The photographs were clinical but disturbing. Close-ups of hands that looked less like drowning victims and more like something had methodically removed flesh from bone in neat, almost surgical strips. The medical examiner's notes used carefully neutral language. Unusual post-mortem predation, and atypical scavenging behavior requiring further study. "Fish don't feed like this," Margaret said quietly. "Neither do any of the mammals we have on the island. Wolves, foxes, even the otters. None of them leave marks like that." Daniel closed the folder and slid it back across the table. "So you think something ate Thomas Hendricks? I think something happened to Thomas Hendricks that doesn't fit the standard explanation. And I think if Tyler Jameson went missing on the same trail, during the same season, 3 years later, we need to consider the possibility that there's a pattern." The word hung in the air between them. Pattern. loaded with implications that Daniel's rational mind immediately rejected. Patterns required intention. Patterns required intelligence. Patterns required something that existed beyond the random chaos of nature. And Daniel had built his entire career on the principle that nature didn't need help being deadly. "Show me Tyler's last known position," he said finally, because speculation was useless and action was all that mattered. Margaret unfolded a topographic map across the table, her finger tracing the Greenstone Ridge Trail from Rock Harbor to the western end of the island. "Last check-in was here, at Hatchet Lake campsite 4 days ago." He radioed on his PLB to confirm location and reported normal conditions. Weather was clear, temperature was 38 degrees, no equipment problems. Daniel studied the map, calculating distances and elevation changes. Greenstone Ridge ran along the spine of the island, a 40-mile traverse through some of the most isolated terrain in the lower 48. In summer, it was a popular route, crowded enough that you'd encounter other hikers every few miles. In November, with the ferry service suspended and temperatures dropping below freezing at night, it was as close to genuine wilderness as you could find east of the Rockies. He would have made Wendigo by now even if he was moving slow, Daniel said. If he's still on the trail, something stopped him. Or he went off trail. Margaret's expression suggested she didn't believe that any more than Daniel did. The volunteer who checks the Wendigo station twice a week did a preliminary sweep yesterday. No sign of Tyler, no sign of disturbance, no equipment cached at any of the standard campsites. Daniel pulled out his own map, comparing it against Margaret's and noting the contour lines that indicated steep terrain and the blue markers showing water sources. In November, most of the inland lakes would be starting to freeze, turning reliable water into a logistical problem. If Tyler had been injured or had lost his filter, dehydration could have set in faster than hypothermia. "I'll start at Hatchet Lake and work west," Daniel said, already running scenarios. If he's mobile and lost, he'll be following drainage, probably ended up in one of the valleys off the ridgeline. If he's immobile, he's within a mile of his last known position. And if he's dead? Margaret's voice was flat, the question of a bureaucrat who needed answers for paperwork, not a field ranger who understood that death in the backcountry was usually slow and undignified. "Then I'll find the body, and we'll classify it as exposure." Daniel started repacking his gear, checking the battery level on his GPS and making sure his radio was set to the correct frequency. "Unless I find something that suggests otherwise." Margaret watched him work for a moment, then pulled a third folder from her desk. Older than the others, the edges worn soft with handling. "Before you go, you should know there's more than just Hendrix. I pulled historical records going back to when the island became a park in 1940. Over the last 69 years, we've had 14 disappearances during winter months. 14 people who came to Isle Royale between November and March and were never seen again." Daniel paused, his hand on the zipper of his pack. 14 over 7 decades isn't statistically unusual for an isolated wilderness area. 14 where we never found bodies, Margaret clarified. 14 where search and rescue turned up absolutely nothing. No equipment, no remains, no evidence of where they went or what happened to them. The only pattern is the timing. Every single disappearance happened during a winter, when the temperature dropped below zero for extended periods, and the island was essentially cut off from the mainland. Daniel felt that irritation again, stronger now, mixing with something that might have been unease if he'd been the type of person who indulged in unease. "You're suggesting what, exactly? That there's something on this island that hunts people when it gets cold enough?" "I'm suggesting that you should be careful." Margaret's voice carried none of the defensive edge from earlier, just flat, practical concern. "I'm suggesting that if you find Tyler and something seems wrong, trust your instincts. And I'm suggesting that you take this." She pulled something from the bottom drawer of her desk and set it on the table between them. It was a leather-bound journal, old enough that the cover had developed the kind of patina that came from decades of handling, and wrapped with a fraying cord that might have once been red, but had faded to the color of dried blood. "What is this?" Daniel made no move to touch it. "Field notes from Samuel Cartwright, the first park superintendent of Isle Royale. He served from 1940 until 1952, when he resigned for what the records call personal reasons. This was in his desk when his replacement arrived. It's never been officially cataloged or entered into the archive. Daniel finally picked up the journal, untying the cord, and opening to a random page. The handwriting was cramped and precise, the kind of penmanship that suggested someone educated before typewriters became standard. He read a passage dated February 1947, third disappearance this winter. Martin Svoboda, experienced trapper, found only his camp. Tent collapsed, supplies scattered, no sign of struggle. The Ojibwe guide refused to continue the search after the second day. Said the spirits were hungry this season, that the Wendigo walks when the ice thickens. Superstitious nonsense, but I cannot ignore the fear in his eyes. Daniel closed the journal and set it down carefully. Wendigo. That's not even good folklore. It's a bastardization of Wedico, an Algonquian myth about cannibalism and spiritual corruption. It's the same kind of cultural boogeyman that every isolated community invents to explain why people die in harsh conditions. Maybe. Margaret picked up the journal and tucked it back in her drawer. Or maybe Samuel Cartwright saw something that made him question his assumptions. Same as the Ojibwe guide. Same as I'm starting to question mine. I don't believe in monsters, Margaret. Neither do I. She met his eyes with an expression that was disturbingly earnest. But I believe in things I don't understand. And I believe that if you find Tyler Jameson in pieces like we found Thomas Hendricks, you're going to have to admit that maybe your rational explanations don't cover everything that happens on this island. Daniel shouldered his pack, feeling the familiar weight settle against his spine. I'll radio when I reach Hatchet Lake. If I'm not back in 48 hours, send Kowalski with extraction. There won't be any extraction if that weather front moves faster than predicted. Margaret followed him to the door. Be safe, Daniel. And if you see something that doesn't make sense, I'll document it and find the logical explanation. Daniel stepped out into the November cold, feeling the temperature drop, hit his exposed skin like a physical pressure. Because there's always a logical explanation. The hike from Rock Harbor to Hatchet Lake took 6 hours of steady movement through terrain that grew progressively more isolated with each mile. Daniel maintained a pace that was brisk enough to keep his core temperature elevated, but conservative enough to avoid the kind of exertion that would leave him soaked with sweat and vulnerable when he stopped. The trail wound through forests of birch and spruce, past lakes that were beginning to develop a skin of ice around their margins, and over rocky ridges where the wind cut through his layers with methodical efficiency. He'd expected silence, the kind of profound quiet that came with deep wilderness in late autumn. But what he found instead was a peculiar absence that felt qualitatively different from ordinary stillness. No bird calls, no rustle of small mammals in the undergrowth, no distant crack of branches as deer moved through the forest. Just wind and his own breathing, and the rhythmic crunch of his boots on frost-hardened ground. By the time he reached Hatchet Lake, the sun was already low on the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees and turning the partially frozen lake into a mirror that reflected the sky in shades of orange and purple. Tyler's campsite was easy to identify, a cleared space near the water's edge where the ground showed signs of recent use. Daniel approached carefully, his mind automatically cataloging details and sorting them into categories of normal and anomalous. Normal. Tent site with compressed vegetation indicating proper setup and takedown. Fire ring with cold ashes that looked about 4 days old, consistent with Tyler's last check-in. No food waste or improperly stored supplies. Anomalous. Boot prints leading away from the campsite toward the trail, then doubling back in a confused pattern that suggested uncertainty or disorientation. Scratches on a nearby tree at about shoulder height, deep enough to remove bark and expose pale wood underneath. And something else, a smell that Daniel's rational mind wanted to classify as decomposition, but that didn't quite match any animal carcass he'd encountered before. He followed the boot prints, watching them overlap and contradict themselves in ways that suggested Tyler had been pacing or searching for something. They led away from the camp in the direction of the next shelter, then circled back, then ventured off trail toward a stand of dense spruce. Daniel tracked them into the trees, his hand instinctively checking the bear spray on his belt even though Isle Royale had no bears, and the wolves here avoided humans with a persistence that bordered on pathological. The prints ended at a small clearing where the ground had been disturbed in a way that looked almost like something had been digging, or like something had emerged from underground. The soil was torn up in irregular patterns, exposing roots and rocks, and in the center of the disturbance was a single item that made Daniel's chest tighten with an emotion he refused to acknowledge as fear. Tyler's GPS unit, a Garmin identical to Daniel's own. The screen cracked and the casing scratched as if it had been handled roughly. Daniel pulled an evidence bag from his pack and carefully collected the device, noting that the power button was stuck in the on position, and the screen, though damaged, was still faintly backlit. He pressed the menu button, and the unit flickered to life, displaying a track log that made absolutely no sense. According to the data, Tyler had traveled 17 miles in the past 4 days, but the track showed him moving in a pattern that looped and spiraled across terrain, where the topographic map indicated cliffs and lakes that would have been impossible to traverse. The waypoints were labeled with timestamps that suggested Tyler had been moving almost continuously, day and night, barely stopping to rest. Daniel checked his own GPS, confirming his position and comparing it against Tyler's track log. If the data was accurate, and there was no reason to think it wasn't given that GPS satellites didn't lie, then Tyler had passed within 200 yards of this exact spot at least 6 times over the past 96 hours, moving in circles that grew progressively tighter until the last waypoint, recorded approximately 8 hours ago, placed him less than a mile northwest of Hatchet Lake. 8 hours. Recent enough that Daniel might catch him if he moved fast. Recent enough that Tyler might still be alive. Daniel pulled out his radio, keying the mic. Rock Harbor Base, this is Ranger Reeves. I'm at Hatchet Lake campsite and I've recovered the missing hiker's GPS unit. Track log indicates recent movement within search radius. Pursuing northwest toward... He checked his map, finding the nearest named feature. Toward Island Mine Trail. Will maintain radio protocol. Over. Static hissed back at him for a long moment before Margaret's voice cut through, distorted by distance and atmospheric interference. Copy that, Daniel. Weather update shows the front accelerating. You've got maybe 24 hours before conditions become unsafe for air extraction. Find him fast. Over. Understood. Reeves out. He clipped the radio back to his belt and set off at a pace that was faster than wise but slower than panic would have dictated. The trail northwest from Hatchet Lake was poorly maintained this late in the season, overgrown in places and obscured by fallen leaves that concealed roots and rocks capable of turning an ankle. Daniel moved with the particular focus that came from years of backcountry work. His attention split between the terrain ahead and the constant mental calculation of distance, time, and available daylight. The sun dropped below the tree line as he hiked, and the temperature plummeted with a speed that suggested the incoming weather front was even closer than Margaret had predicted. Daniel felt the cold settle into his joints, felt the moisture in his breath start to crystallize against the fabric of his neck gaiter. He pulled out his headlamp and switched it on, the LED beam cutting through gathering darkness and creating the kind of tunnel vision that made the forest feel smaller and more claustrophobic than it had in daylight. He found the first of Tyler's discarded equipment a mile from Hatchet Lake, a water bottle lying in the middle of the trail, partially crushed as if it had been stepped on repeatedly. Daniel picked it up, noting that it was empty, and that the plastic was scratched with the same kind of gouges he'd seen on the tree near Tyler's campsite. He bagged it and continued, moving faster now, because abandoned equipment meant Tyler was either lightening his load in a panic or losing things without realizing it, and either scenario suggested someone who was past the point of rational decision-making. The second item was a fleece jacket, torn across the back and stained with something dark that Daniel's headlamp couldn't quite resolve into a color that made sense. He knelt to examine it, pulling the fabric taut and noting that the tears followed a pattern. 4 parallel lines that could have been from claws, except that nothing on Isle Royale had claws that size. Daniel took photographs with his digital camera, documenting the evidence with the same mechanical efficiency he'd use for any search and rescue operation, while a small voice in the back of his mind that sounded disturbingly like Margaret whispered that maybe he should be paying attention to the things that didn't fit his standard explanations. He was standing to continue the search when he heard it, a sound that his brain initially tried to classify as wind, but that his instincts recognized as something else entirely. It started as a low moan, almost subsonic, that he felt in his chest cavity before he actually heard it. Then it rose in pitch and volume, becoming a cry that was simultaneously human and utterly wrong, as if someone was trying to scream but had forgotten how vocal cords worked. The sound came from ahead, off trail to the west, and Daniel's body moved before his mind had finished processing the decision to investigate. He pushed through dense undergrowth, following the cries as they escalated into something that resembled words, but in a language his linguistic centers couldn't parse. The beam of his headlamp bounced across tree trunks and exposed roots, creating a disorienting strobe effect that made distance and depth impossible to judge. He broke into a small clearing and stopped, his body frozen by something that wasn't quite fear, but was close enough that the distinction hardly mattered. Tyler Jameson was crouched in the center of the clearing, his body folded into a position that looked anatomically improbable, his hands clawing at the frozen ground with a desperation that had already torn through his gloves and opened the skin beneath. He was making that sound, that awful, not quite human vocalization. And even in the inadequate light of Daniel's headlamp, it was obvious that something had gone catastrophically wrong with the young man's condition. Tyler. Daniel kept his voice calm, professional, the tone he'd use with anyone in medical distress. Tyler, my name is Daniel Reeves. I'm a park ranger. I'm here to help you. Tyler's head snapped up, and Daniel felt his carefully maintained rationality fracture at the edges. The young man's eyes caught the light and reflected it back like an animal's, glowing with a color that wasn't quite natural. His face was gaunt, skin pulled tight over bone structure that seemed to have sharpened over the past 4 days, cheekbones jutting and jawline cutting angles that the photograph in Margaret's folder hadn't shown. His lips were cracked and bleeding, and there was something dark crusted around his mouth that Daniel's first aid training wanted to identify as dried blood. Hungry, Tyler said, and his voice was a rasp that sounded like vocal cords rubbed raw. So hungry. Can't stop thinking about it. Need to. He lunged, not at Daniel but at the ground, his hands digging into the frozen soil with renewed frenzy. Daniel moved forward, his training overriding his instinctive repulsion, reaching out to grab Tyler's shoulder and pull him back from whatever compulsion was driving him to tear at the earth. The moment his hand made contact, Tyler's head whipped around with inhuman speed, and Daniel saw the young man's mouth open impossibly wide, teeth that seemed too numerous and too sharp, breath that smelled like meat left in the sun for days. Tyler lunged again, this time directly at Daniel, fingers hooked into claws and that awful keening sound escalating into something that might have been a word. Weetie-cow. Daniel reacted with the muscle memory of someone who'd spent 2 decades dealing with violent wilderness encounters, bringing his forearm up to block and stepping back in a movement that should have put distance between them. But Tyler was faster than human reflexes should have allowed, his hand connecting with Daniel's jacket and tearing fabric with a sound like canvas ripping. They grappled for a moment that felt stretched and nightmarish, Tyler's inhuman strength pushing Daniel backward into a tree trunk, with enough force to knock the air from his lungs. Daniel's hand found the bear spray on his belt, fumbling with the safety cap while Tyler's face pressed close enough that Daniel could count the broken blood vessels in his eyes, could smell the wrongness of his breath, could see the desperate animal terror beneath the hunger that had consumed the young man's humanity. The spray discharged directly into Tyler's face at point-blank range, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Tyler staggered back, clawing at his eyes and making a sound that was pure animal agony, a shriek that echoed through the forest and seemed to be answered by something in the distance. Another cry, deeper and older, that made the hair on Daniel's arms stand up beneath his thermal layers. Daniel didn't wait to see if Tyler would recover. He ran, crashing through the undergrowth with all the grace of a panicked civilian, his headlamp beam bouncing wildly and his breath coming in gasps that had nothing to do with physical exertion. Behind him he could hear Tyler following, could hear the sound of branches breaking and that awful keening that wasn't quite human. And beneath it all was a new sound, the crunch of multiple footsteps moving through the forest, coordinated and purposeful, converging on his position. His rational mind, That part of him that had spent 23 years denying the existence of anything that couldn't be explained by science and statistics was screaming explanations at him. Tyler had hypothermia-induced psychosis. The sounds were wolves, displaced and desperate. The eyes were a trick of the light. The strength was adrenaline-fueled hysteria. The smell was gangrene from frostbite. Everything had a logical explanation, but the part of him that had evolved to recognize predators, the part that existed before language and logic, knew with absolute certainty that he was being hunted. He reached the main trail and made the tactical decision to follow it east, back toward Rock Harbor and civilization and explanations that might actually make sense in the cold light of dawn. His lungs burned in the freezing air, his legs were cramping from the combination of exertion and cold, and his headlamp was starting to dim in a way that suggested the batteries were failing faster than they should in these temperatures. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit had multiplied. Not just Tyler now, but others, at least 3, maybe more, moving through the forest with a coordination that suggested pack intelligence. Daniel risked a glance back and immediately wished he hadn't, because his headlamp beam caught something moving between the trees, something that was too tall and too angular to be human, with limbs that bent at joints that weren't quite right. He focused on running, on putting distance between himself and whatever was pursuing him, on reaching the relative safety of Rock Harbor where there were people and lights and radio contact with the mainland. The trail blurred beneath his feet, his vision narrowing to the small circle of illumination provided by his dying headlamp, his world reduced to the simple binary of forward movement or death. He didn't see the ice until he was already on it. The trail crossed a small stream that should have been liquid this early in the season, but that the dropping temperatures had transformed into a treacherous glaze across rock. Daniel's boots lost traction, his legs went out from under him, and he went down hard enough that his vision whited out for a moment, and his equipment scattered across the frozen stone. By the time he managed to push himself upright, they were already there. 5 figures standing in a loose semicircle at the edge of his headlamp's reach, their bodies silhouetted against the lesser darkness of the forest. 4 of them had postures that were almost human, but stretched and wrong, as if someone had taken a person and elongated them on a rack until their proportions stopped making anatomical sense. The 5th was Tyler, recognizable only by the remnants of his camping gear, his body already beginning the transformation into something that Daniel's mind refused to fully process. And behind them, barely visible in the darkness beyond his light's reach, was something else. Something that might have been human once, so long ago that only the vaguest shape remained. A towering form with antlers that weren't quite antlers, with eyes that glowed with a color that existed outside the normal spectrum, with an aura of such profound wrongness that Daniel's nervous system was sending panic signals that bypassed his rational brain entirely. The thing that had been Tyler took a step forward, and when it spoke, its voice was layered with harmonics that suggested multiple throats, multiple lungs, as if the transformation was happening from the inside out. "Join us," it said, and beneath the words Daniel heard the sound of breaking bones and tearing flesh, heard the whisper of ancient appetites older than the forests themselves. Join us, and the hunger stops. Join us, and you'll never feel cold again. Join us, and... No. Daniel's voice came out steadier than he felt, and he was surprised to find that even now, even confronted with the absolute impossibility of what he was witnessing, his rational mind was still trying to function. You're hypothermic, all of you. You're experiencing severe cognitive impairment and shared psychosis induced by environmental stressors. You're sick. Let me help you. The thing behind Tyler made a sound that might have been laughter if laughter could be translated into something that predated human language. It took a step forward, and now Daniel could see it more clearly. Could see that its body was a patchwork of human features twisted and recombined into a form that suggested what humans might become if they stopped being human and started being something else. Something that existed in the space between survival and damnation, between hunger and satisfaction, between death and the infinite appetite that followed. "Weetikau," it whispered, and the word carried weight that Daniel felt in his bone marrow. "Weetikau Napu." The hunger made flesh. The price of winter. The thing that walks when the ice grows thick and the belly grows empty. Daniel's hand found his radio, his fingers numb with cold as he keyed the mic. Rock Harbor, this is Reeves. Emergency situation. I've located Tyler Jameson and... His voice cracked because how did you describe this? How did you put into official language the complete breakdown of everything you thought you understood about reality? And multiple others in extreme medical distress, requesting immediate extraction and medical evacuation. Over. Only static answered him. The radio might be out of range, or the battery might have failed, or the atmospheric conditions might be interfering with transmission. Or maybe there was no one listening anymore, because maybe Rock Harbor was already gone, consumed by the same hunger that had taken Tyler and the others, transformed into feeding ground for something that predated the Park Service and the Coast Guard and every rational institution humanity had built to protect itself from the darkness. The thing that might have been human once took another step forward, and Daniel saw with absolute clarity that he had a choice. He could run, and he might make it back to Rock Harbor, might make it to the float plane, might make it off this island before the weather front closed in. Or he could stay, and he could try to help Tyler and the others, could try to apply first aid and wilderness medicine to a situation that had clearly moved beyond anything his training had prepared him for. His rational mind chose for him, chose flight, chose survival, chose the preservation of evidence and documentation over the naive belief that he could save anyone. He grabbed his scattered equipment, his hands shaking so badly he could barely grip the straps of his pack, and he ran. The forest became a tunnel of terror, his headlamp beam stabbing through darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. Behind him he heard them following, not running because whatever they'd become didn't need to run. They could take their time, could let the cold and the exhaustion and the slowly creeping awareness that there was no escape do the work for them. Daniel ran until his lungs felt like they'd been scraped raw, until his legs stopped responding to his commands, until his headlamp finally died and left him stumbling through darkness that was absolute and suffocating. He ran until he couldn't run anymore, until his body simply gave out and deposited him in a heap against a fallen log, his chest heaving and his vision swimming with exhaustion. He lay there in the darkness, listening to the sound of footsteps approaching through the forest, and he thought about Margaret's warning and Samuel Cartwright's journal and all the things he'd dismissed as superstition and folklore, because accepting them would have meant admitting that the universe was stranger and more terrible than his rational mind could accommodate. The footsteps stopped. In the darkness, Daniel heard breathing, slow and measured, the breathing of something that didn't need to hurry because its prey was already caught. Then, impossibly, a voice. Margaret's voice, distorted by radio static, but unmistakable. Daniel? Daniel, if you can hear this, we've got your GPS signal. Kowalski is prepping the Beaver for emergency extraction. Hold your position and keep your radio on. We're coming for you. Daniel's hand found his radio, found that the power light was still glowing faintly. He'd been wrong about the transmission failure. Rock Harbor had been listening all along. He keyed the mic with fingers that felt like frozen wood. "Margaret," he whispered, because speaking any louder might attract the attention of the things he could hear moving in the darkness around him. "Don't come. Whatever you do, don't send anyone else to this island. Quarantine it. Close it. Make sure no one..." The radio died mid-transmission, its battery finally exhausted, and Daniel was left in silence that felt like a physical presence. He waited for the things to attack, waited for the hunger to consume him, waited for the transformation that would take his humanity and replace it with something older and more terrible. Instead, he heard them withdraw, heard the footsteps moving away through the forest, back toward whatever dark places they emerged from when the temperature dropped and the ice thickened. Heard in the distance the sound of Tyler's voice, still recognizably human, still calling for help, but with an edge that suggested the transformation was continuing even as the thing fought against it. And Daniel understood, with a clarity that was worse than any terror he'd felt during the pursuit, that they'd let him go, that he'd been allowed to escape, not because he'd earned it through strength or cunning, but because he was more useful as a witness than as another victim. Because someone needed to carry the story back to the mainland. Someone needed to tell people what lived on Isle Royale when winter came, and the cold made the hunger unbearable. Someone needed to be the warning that would draw more people to the island, more victims seeking to understand what couldn't be understood, more offerings to feed the thing that walked when the ice grew thick. The float plane found him 3 hours later, hypothermic and incoherent, babbling about things that the pilot and the Coast Guard medic carefully didn't acknowledge as they loaded him onto the aircraft. By the time they touched down in Houghton, Daniel had stopped talking entirely, had retreated into a silence that the trauma counselors would later classify as severe psychological shock induced by environmental exposure and wilderness emergency stress. They found Tyler's body 2 weeks later, after the weather cleared and a proper search team could be assembled. The official report stated that Tyler Jamison died of exposure complicated by hypothermia and possible psychotic break. The unofficial report, the one that Margaret read and then quietly filed in the same drawer as Samuel Cartwright's journal, noted the same irregular consumption patterns that had been present on Thomas Hendricks's body, the same gouges in nearby trees, the same evidence of something that didn't match any known predator in the Lake Superior ecosystem. Daniel Reeves resigned from the National Park Service 2 months later, citing personal reasons. He moved to Phoenix, as far from winter and forests and islands as the continental United States would allow. He still dreams about that night, still wakes with the sound of Tyler's transformation echoing in his ears, still feels the weight of that ancient hunger pressing in from the darkness. And sometimes, when the temperature drops and the wind howls and something in the night sounds almost like a human voice crying for help, Daniel remembers the thing that walked when the ice grew thick. He remembers the choice he made to run, the choice to survive, the choice to become a witness to something his rational mind still refuses to fully acknowledge. He remembers, and he keeps his silence, because some stories aren't meant to be believed. Some stories are only meant to be warnings, and some warnings are only heard by those who are already too close to the darkness to turn back. The hunger waits. It always waits. And when winter comes again to Isle Royale, when the temperatures drop below zero and the island becomes isolated from the mainland, the Wedekow walks, looking for those who've lost their way, looking for those whose hunger has grown too powerful to resist, looking for those who will join them in the endless unsatisfied appetite that is both curse and transformation. Daniel knows this now. He knows it with a certainty that transcends rational explanation. He knows it, and he says nothing because silence is the only protection he has left. The hunger waits. And it remembers those who've seen it and escaped. It remembers, and one day, it will call them home. Hope you felt genuine terror. If you appreciate authentic horror rooted in real folklore, consider following for more stories. Which moment scared you most? Share your theory about what happened to Daniel.